A man of diminutive stature, awkward and short-legged, resembling a pear heavy with juice and ready to drop from the branch, to his father, a provincial alcoholic pastor who had driven his wife to an early grave. His penchant for mystification, or quite simply lying about himself, it would become almost impossible to distinguish his own fictions, recounted in his numerous letters and diaries, from the truth. To be born into the family of a poor pastor, to become the representative of a Dutch trading house in Russia at 24, to master 15 languages and circumnavigate the globe, to amass a fortune during the California gold rush, to become the discoverer of ancient Troy and cultivate a reputation as the father of archaeology, and finally, to settle next to the royal palace in Athens. To achieve all of this within a single earthly lifespan, this was a trivial task for the man born Johann Ludwig Heinrich Julius Schliemann. A man of diminutive stature, awkward and short-legged, resembling a pear heavy with juice and ready to drop from the branch, wearing round spectacles and neatly trimmed moustache. He would receive guests in the library of his 25-room mansion on Panepistimiou Street in Athens, a stone's throw from the royal palace. There were no carpets, no curtains, no warm water in the bathrooms, and no soft furniture. In the host's view, none of this existed during the Trojan War, and therefore they had no place here, in the last temple of Troy, the Iliumelatron of Heinrich Schliemann. Guests attempted to settle themselves as best they could on wicker chairs built to the host's own proportions, with the heroes of the Iliad painted onto the walls and ceilings by the Slovenian artist Yuri Šubic bore witness to these comical receptions. The gold, both the ancient hoard unearthed from the ruins of Troy and the brand new gilding covering the column fluting, the scrolls of the desk, or an elegant nape, could not fail to impress. Here in Athens, the capital of a kingdom far from wealthy, adrift between southern Europe and Near East, people were not accustomed to such sights. And which of those guests, shifting uncomfortably on that exceptionally awkward furniture, would have guessed that only 36 years earlier, the gentleman sitting before them, who now dined at his excavations with the Emperor of Brazil and was welcomed at the courts of Europe, had been a distiller's assistant in provincial Fürstenberg, chopping wood, stoking furnaces, and tending the still. Indeed, at the age of 14, Schliemann, the son of Lutheran pastor from the teeny North German town of Neubukow, began working as a shop assistant in a grocery that sold schnapps. Never blessed with robust health, a frail and short youth, standing at rightly 156 centimeters, he spent 5 years in that shop working mostly for food. Later, he moved to Hamburg to work as a dock laborer, scraping by on the dirtiest and most arduous tasks until he began coughing up blood. Perhaps if young Schliemann had possessed a stronger constitution, he might have spent his life as a docker or shopkeeper in Hamburg or Amsterdam. But besides a physique ill-suited to heavy labor, this pastor's son possessed one great talent: a monumental memory and the natural flair for languages. Even during his schooling in Neubukow, he had mastered English and French with phenomenal speed, skills that proved pivotal when he was hired by the trading company of Schröder as a translator. Thus, the myth of Heinrich Schliemann began to take shape. In the years to come, it would become almost impossible to distinguish his own fictions, recounted in his numerous letters and diaries, from the truth. First emerged in 1841, when the 19-year-old Schliemann returned from his first business trip to Venezuela. It was then, incidentally, that he began a deep study of Spanish, the fourth language in his collection. In a letter to his relatives, Schliemann claimed he had set sail from Venezuela to Amsterdam aboard the three-masted schooner Dorothea, which was shipwrecked from the Dutch coast on 11 December 1841. He claimed to be one of the few survivors, and so fortunate that even his trunk containing clothes and letters of recommendation remained unscathed. Most likely, however, young Heinrich arrived in Amsterdam by land and only learned of the Dorothea's fate later from the newspapers. Having secured a position with trading house in Amsterdam, he earned on average twice as much as a schoolteacher of the year. Yet in his autobiography, years later, he would write of the incredible hardship of his early years in the Netherlands. In 1861, he sent his family in Germany a portrait of himself in a Russian fur coat and a high silk hat. The accompanying letter, written while he was living and working in Russia, described him as the director of the Russian Imperial Bank, a claim with no basis in reality. Yet, were he a mere dreamer and fabricator, the name of Heinrich Schliemann would hardly to be remembered today. Alongside his talent for self-mythologizing, he did indeed develop a system that allowed him to master foreign languages with startling efficiency. The process usually unfolded as follows. Schliemann would find a substantial text in the target language. For European tongues, he often used the novel The Adventures of Telemachus by the French theologian François Fénelon. With this volume in hand, Schliemann would seek out a native speaker whom he paid not to teach him, but merely to listen as the strange, awkward German in round glasses read aloud, correcting his pronunciation and intonation while occasionally explaining individual words. In this way, Schliemann filled his vocabulary with ready-made structures and absorbed the grammar through osmosis. According to his own accounts, the method allowed him to master a language in 6 to 8 weeks. By the time his philological exercises were complete, he had memorized The Adventures of Telemachus in its entirety. Beyond his linguistic gift, the son of the North German pastor possessed a staggering tenacity. Despite his frail health, he was capable of working 10 hours a day, Monday to Friday, and 5 hours on weekends, devoting every remaining moment to languages, calligraphy, bookkeeping, and other disciplines essential for international trade. This gradually made Schliemann indispensable. In just 2 years, he rose from a messenger to a head of bureau with 15 subordinates. Coupled with these gifts was an extreme, truly German Lutheran frugality that bordered on parsimony. This trait, like his tendency to embellish his biography, stayed with him for life. Even as a prosperous businessman, importing millions of silver rubles worth of goods, he would continue to haggle over the price of a night's stay in the humblest of inns and urged his relatives to be prudent with the funds he sent them. During his time in Amsterdam, Schliemann also mastered Russian. In those years, Russia was a promising frontier for international trade, and his firm had an agency in St. Petersburg. Thus, in February 1844, at the age of 22, he set off for the Russian Empire as a representative for the Dutch House of Schroeder to secure contracts for tin and dice. He would settle in Russia for a long time, though the harsh climate twice brought this frail man to death's door. However, his spirit was harder to break than his immune system. Whenever he was confined to his bed for months after a 30-degree below zero journey from Moscow to Petersburg, Schliemann spent the time studying languages. By 1855, at 33, He had mastered at least 13 languages, reaching a proficiency that allowed him to keep his diaries in them. Indeed, another peculiar habit of his was to keep his journal in the languages of the country he was currently visiting, and his mercantile duties forced him to travel extensively. Remaining a bachelor all this time, hardly surprising given his 10-hour workdays and language drills, Schliemann eventually took responsibility for his younger siblings, paying for their education and providing monthly allowances. He even sent his brother Ludwig to California at his own expense during the legendary gold rush of the late 1840s. This move proved to be another turning point. In May 1850, Ludwig died of typhoid fever in Sacramento at just 25. Upon hearing the news, Heinrich decided to go to the United States himself. He did not grieve for long. In Sacramento, he swiftly opened a gold buying business. Working without respite from 6 in the morning until 10 at night and ignoring a bout of typhoid that nearly claimed him too, he could earn up to $30,000 a day, roughly equivalent to $1,263,000 in January 2026. Having arrived to visit his brother's grave, Schliemann nearly ended up in one himself, but he survived against the odds and returned to St. Petersburg with a doubled fortune, instantly becoming one of the wealthiest men in the Russian capital. Far from a handsome man, he could not compensate for his physical shortcomings with wealth. His choice fell upon Ekaterina Lyezhina, the niece of his business partner. In this marriage to a highly educated and vicious woman, Schliemann would father 3 children, 2 of whom, his son Sergei and daughter Nadezhda, would survive him. Shortly after his wedding, Schliemann turned his attention to modern Greek, which became the 13th language in his repertoire, following the Danish, Swedish, Polish, and Slovenian. Alongside modern Greek, he began to study ancient Greek with the intent of visiting classical ruins in southern Italy, Greece, and Egypt. By 1856, the annual interest on Schliemann's capital was enough to allow him to retire and never work another day. This, combined with what appeared to be a midlife crisis, prompted him to think of matters more significant than the cheapest way to transport Indigo from Rotterdam to Kronstadt. Life, after all, is not merely an eternal race for domestic comfort. While studying ancient Greek, Schliemann read the classics until they were tattered, but he was particularly obsessed with Homer. It was then, not in early childhood as they later claimed, that he became intoxicated with the heroic world of the ancients. He believed in the literal truth of the Iliad as fervently as he believed in the sanctity of the Bible. For Lutheran, after all, there are no intermediaries between God and man except the sacred text. Thus, the idea took root. The fortune amassed through dangerous and exhausting toil could be spent on searching for the ancient cities described by Homer. Surely they lay somewhere, hidden beneath the earth. However, this spiritual impulse was not shared by his Russian wife, Ekaterina, who flatly refused to leave St. Petersburg. Heinrich began to contemplate divorce and set off the Mediterranean alone. During this journey, he failed to enjoy Greece. In Damascus, he caught another fever and nearly died upon arriving in Athens. Only once he had recovered did he return to Russia to seek a divorce, but a major disappointment awaited him. Russian law at the time did not allow for the annulment of a legal marriage while both spouses were still living. Of course, this story is not a prelude to a tale of a misunderstood husband murdering his pedestrian wife, thought that would have made for an effective climax. Instead, while settling his business affairs and seeking a distraction from his marital woes, Schliemann embarked on a world tour. He visited Tunis, Egypt, where he again nearly died of some ecstatic malady, Italy, India, Shanghai, Indonesia, China, Japan, and the United States. At the end of this voyage, he settled in Paris, where he purchased apartment buildings containing 270 flats, living his best life on the rental income. Finally, the 43-year-old millionaire could fill the gaps in his youth and obtain the formal academic education that had been denied. It was then Schliemann realized his marriage to Ekaterina could not continue. To every player to join him in Paris, she replied with a refusal. So Schliemann decided to resort to cunning. Before his family affairs were settled, however, Schliemann took his first real steps into archaeology. He visited the excavations on the Palatine Hill in Rome and at Pompeii, before heading to the Greek island of Ithaca, the home of Homer's Odysseus. Staying for 10 days, he hired a local illiterate miller as a guide, a man who nonetheless knew the entire Odyssey by heart and showed Schliemann the ruins of a palace. The impressed Russo-German millionaire immediately took it to be the palace of Odysseus himself. Without a second thought, Schliemann began his own excavations, guided only by Homeric texts, Pliny the Elder, and Strabo. Though he found no proof that the hill was the site of the legendary palace, it was there, on that island of myths, amidst the ultramarine tides of the Ionian Sea, that the true spirit of research was born in Heinrich Schliemann, the awkward son of an alcoholic pastor. After Ithaca, Schliemann briefly returned to the States and, by bribing local officials in New York, obtained a certificate stating he had lived in America continuously for 5 years, the requirement for citizenship. That black passport with the eagle was necessary for one reason: to legally divorce his Russian wife. Russia might forbid it, but the USA, the land of the free, would surely permit it. As an American citizen, he moved to Indianapolis, which at the time had the most liberal family laws in the country. Buying a house and investing in a local starch factory, he quickly established a reputation as a solid member of local society. He then petitioned for divorce, framing Ekaterina's refusal to move to Paris as a refusal to live with him in the United States and portraying himself as a devoted American patriot. The court in Indianapolis naturally sided with him. Equally naturally, the court in St. Petersburg refused to recognize the divorce and declared Heinrich Schliemann a bigamist when, immediately after the trial, he headed to Athens to marry Sophia, the young daughter of a Greek merchant who had been found for him by his former Greek teacher. Sophia would become Schliemann's muse and companion for the rest of his life. Settling with her in the Greek capital, Heinrich surrendered himself entirely to his new passion, archaeology. Before his divorce, during his travels, Schliemann had made the acquaintance of Frank Calvert, the British-American consul in Turkey and an amateur archaeologist who was equally obsessed with finding Troy. Calvert had gone as far as buying part of the Mount of Hisarlik, where ancient evidence suggested the ruins of Homer's city lay. By then, Schliemann had mastered Ottoman Turkish to a level that allowed him to correspond with Turkish officials attempting to buy the other half of the mount and began excavations alongside Calvert. Eventually, having scaled the endless walls of Greco-Turkish bureaucracy, Schliemann began his excavations. He hired 16 laborers, 8 Greeks and 8 Turks. This balanced team allowed work to continue during religious holidays. nothing stopped the Greeks from working during Ramadan, or the Turks during Christmas and Easter. However, his relationship with the workers was not always smooth. Heinrich's strict ban on smoking during work led to a strike by the tobacco-dependent shepherd-turned-archaeologists and a week-long delay. In archaeology, as in trade, he got rid of anything superfluous, bad habits, unnecessary expenses, or the later strata built atop what he believed to be the original Troy. Consequently, he ruthlessly destroyed the Roman and Hellenistic layers, preserving only the most spectacular artifacts, such as a marble metop depicting the sun god Helios in his chariot, which he later sold to the Louvre for £5,000. The work at Hisarlik lasted months and the crew grew to 400 men. Malaria and conjunctivitis became rampant. The 30-degree heat and dust storms were hardly conducive to a sterile workplace. Heinrich himself fell ill again and stopped leaving his tent. It was then that the long-awaited discovery occurred. Workers struck Cyclopean masonry, walls of massive, unmortared boulders, typical of the era of Troy and Mycenae. This masonry dated to the 3rd and 2nd millennia before Christ, rightly the time of the Trojan War. Schliemann's joy was tempered only by his health and news from Athens that Sophia had given birth to a stillborn daughter. Summoning his last strength, he halted the excavations for a month and returned to Greece to be with his wife. By September 1873, despite his failing health, he returned to the camp at Hisarlik. What happened next is likely another of Schliemann's mystifications. We know for certain that between 31 May and 17 June 1873 he discovered a hoard, or several, containing 8,833 objects: copper, silver and gold vessels, rings, bracelets, necklaces and weapons. These items were unauthored and catalogued by Schliemann alone. This fact later sparked rumors of forgery and claims that many of the treasures were commissioned from Greek craftsmen. Schliemann insisted to the world that these items were the Priam's treasure, belonging to the legendary king of Troy. According to Homer, Priam ruled during the war. Unfortunately for Schliemann, there are two problems. First, there is no proof of the literal accuracy of Homer's texts. The poet lived at least 300 or 400 years after the events he described. Second, Schliemann was not a trained archaeologist and lacked an understanding of stratigraphy. As it turned out, Priam's treasure was found in a lair from the 24th century BC, meaning it was at least 1,200 years older than the legendary King Priam. Our hero, however, would never know this. For him, these ancient trinkets were the material embodiment of one of history's greatest myths. Unwilling to share the find with the Turks, Schliemann smuggled the treasure to Athens. There, the famous photograph was taken, printed in newspapers across Europe, of Sophia Schliemann adorned in the jewels of Helen of Troy. Schliemann unsuccessfully tried to donate his finds to museums in Greece, Italy, and France. These governments wished to avoid a diplomatic scandal, as Turkey officially accused Schliemann of stealing the lawful property of the Ottoman Sultan. The matter was settled when Schliemann paid a fine of 10,000 French francs. Eventually, he sold the collection to the Royal Museums of Berlin, where Priam's treasure remained until the end of the Second World War. It was then taken by the Soviets and kept secret until the turn of this country. Today, to see the treasures of Troy, twice as old as the Homeric myth itself, one must travel to the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Buoyed by his success and now a world-famous discoverer, despite the justified criticism of professional scholars, Schliemann turned to the second century of the Homeric epics. Mycenae, the city-state that supposedly went to war against Troy 3,200 years ago. The location of Mycenae was far better known than that of Troy. Its ruins lie near the port of Naples on the Peloponnese, a 2-hour drive from Athens. Before Schliemann, others had studied Mycenae, including Lord Elgin, whose collection of marbles remains a bone of contention between Greece and the United Kingdom. But Schliemann approached Mycenae with the support of the local authorities. The Greek government's condition was that he waive any claim to the artifacts, including the gold. And gold there was. Nearly 13 kilograms. Despite torrential rains and the November cold of 1876, in less than 3 months, Schliemann made sensational discoveries, the most significant being 5 shaft graves. This had been described by the ancient geographer Pausanias in the 2nd century AD. For Schliemann, this was proof of the epic's truth. Naturally, the occupants were immediately identified as King Agamemnon, his wife Clytemnestra, and their family. And, naturally, he was wrong. The graves were at least 3 centuries older than the Trojan War heroes. Nevertheless, the funeral mask of a Mycenaean noble with a magnificent moustache, one of the icons of Greek archaeology, is still called the Mask of Agamemnon, even though it could not possibly have belonged to him. Yet, all this does not mean that the Trojan War, Agamemnon, Paris, or Menelaus never existed, doesn't it? Schliemann spent the remainder of his life lecturing across Europe, writing articles and memoirs, and furnishing his luxurious Athenian residence, the Iliomelathron, named after Ilion, the capital of Troy. That palace still stands on Panepistimiou Street, now housing the National Numismatic Museum. In 1884, alongside his friend Wilhelm Dorpfeld, Schliemann excavated Tiryns, another city from the Homeric epics. The finds there were less dazzling than the gold of Mycenae, but they finally convinced the scientific community of the historical reality of the Mycenaean civilization. Perhaps Heinrich Schliemann is one of the few people in history who managed to be a pioneer not only of our past, but of our future. In the summer of 1889, while in Paris, he was one of the first to climb the 2nd level of the Eiffel Tower, then still under construction. He made a remark that I find very touching, perhaps the most sincere he ever uttered. This tower is 4 times higher than the steeple in Ankershagen, and yet, in my childhood, that steeple seemed to me the tallest thing in the world. On Christmas Eve 1890, guests at a hotel in Piazza Umberto in Naples witnessed 4 men carrying a small, awkward man with a neatly trimmed moustache and round spectacles into the foyer. He had always ignored doctor's orders and never allowed himself to lie idle. Until his final days, he took cold sea baths and rode on horseback, despite suffering from chronic ear infections and meningitis. On the morning of 26 December 1890, in Naples, the myth of Heinrich Schliemann came to an end. He is buried in Athens, in the city's first cemetery, in a mausoleum designed after an ancient sanctuary built for fallen heroes. In a sense, he was a hero, daring, always defying the rules, and firmly believing in his destiny to prove that myth is not just a murky reflection of our past, but a part of our reality, and at times it can even replace that reality. In the end, what remains of a man? Bones, ashes, and a story. Let me know what you think about the Schliemann's life in comments. Don't forget to subscribe and, of course, see you soon in your next travel. The Nobel Prize laureate for literature, French writer Albert Camus, wrote in his immortal novel The Plague: "The most convenient way of getting to know a city is by looking at how people work there, how they love, and how they die." In days gone by, when travel was a pastime reserved for the upper echelons of society, guidebooks, published in limited editions, focused precisely on the sensory perception of a city, on what is, in fact, the primary and only true perception of reality. They introduced their readers to the past by delicately viewing it into the fabric of the present. By overlaying this pattern onto the optics of literature, architecture, painting, and other urban achievements, they provided the traveler with more than just a list of must-see addresses. They laid bare the very fate of the city and its inhabitants. In this guidebook, you will find no addresses for shopping centers, no accounts of when their sales began. You can find such things in thousands of other books. I offer you a different formula. Having filed this book with dozens of highly detailed maps and having devised 3 unique routes for you, I believe that every journey we take is a little life. We must strive to fill it with events and impressions as densely as possible, for there may never be a second chance. I invite you to briefly cast aside all things material and set off in search of the true urban soul, hidden behind the garish posters and unpainted facades of my native city, the ancient and ever-surviving Athens. My guidebook is available on all Amazon marketplaces via this QR code and the link in the description.